All right, so I spent 7 classes, or 6 or 7 classes, simply setting the pace or setting the stage to show that Revelation is an expansion of Matthew chapter 24. And by that, Matthew 24, I mean verses 3 through 34, which focuses upon the destruction of Jerusalem. And in my view, Revelation is simply an expansion of those thoughts. So with that in mind, I'm always tempted to go back and pick up a couple of those pieces, but I don't want to do that necessarily. We won't have time for all of that, but we have the classes, they have the materials, we have several handouts on that. So that really gives us the direction that we need to go in Revelation. So with that in mind, now we're headed off in that direction. So now we're looking at the different chapters. So here's how it breaks down. It's where we are now. Any question, by the way, regarding that? I always want to stop and say if there's any thoughts about it. So that's the overview. That's a pretty simple overview, isn't it? So, and by the way, this is not a popular view. This is one that probably is not heard of very much. But we've talked about all that in the past. But today, the popular view, and I'm going to say this, I'm saddened by this, that Bible study has become simply a little post on Facebook is what a lot of people have, and that's kind of how they think about things, and it doesn't go any deeper than that, and that to me is very, very sad. But be that as it may, the first half of the book, the revelation of the Lamb of the bride, is the second half, but the revelation of the Lamb, that is Christ, here's the outline of chapters 4 through 11. Now remember, chapters 1 through 3 is the prologue. Sets us up. Who are the 7 churches? John writes to the 7 churches. We've been through that material in brief form. So now we're ready for chapters 4 through 11. And the action actually begins in chapter 6. So what is chapter 4 and 5? Well, as you see, chapters 4 and 5 is the commission. That is the Lamb's commissioning of the horsemen that are going to ride in chapter 6, and really setting the pace, or actually it's a scene of worship in which we have all of it set up for us in pictorial directory form about what's about to happen. And so it's interesting that we have 2 chapters that are dedicated to the worship of the Lamb and what's about to take place. So with that in mind, let's think about what I call simply an overview of it. And so with your Bible here in your lap, you might just notice chapters 4 and 5, and we'll just glance at some of these texts very, very quickly. Number 1, you have a vision of the throne. This is chapter 4. You have a vision of the throne, and John is called up to the throne, and then you have the one sitting on it revealed to us in verse 3. Then you have 24 elders, verse 4. Lightnings, voices, and thunders, verse 5. Then you have the glassy sea, which I take to be really a polished floor, is the scene that is given there in verse 6. The 4 living creatures, verses 6 through 8. And then finally the heavenly worship at the last of chapter 4, verses 8 through 11. And we'll note some things regarding that worship. Then we have in chapter 5, we have the book that is revealed here, verses 1 through 4, that the Lamb is going to open. And he's going to open the book 1 seal at a time. It's closed with 7 seals. Remember, it's a scroll, so he's going to open 1 seal at a time. Number 2, you have the Lamb mentioned in the midst of the throne, or between the individuals surrounding the throne, which is what in the midst of the throne means. So you have the Lamb mentioned in verses 5 through 7. And then you have verses 8 through 14, once again, a scene of worship, which is, once again, interesting because it's the second scene of worship that we have, where we have the living creatures and the elders worshiping, the songs of angels, the songs of those living creatures, the songs of the whole creation. And then we have the response of the living creatures and the elders in verse 14. That's chapter 5, verse 14. They said, "Amen," and they fell down and worshiped. So that's what we have as far as the outline of the chapters are concerned. So just looking at it, we might ask this question, what is the primary theme here? What would you say is the primary theme? And also, why would we have such a scene that is given here? Now this is not, I don't know that there's a right answer and a wrong answer, but why would we have such a scene as this one? And what is the emphasis in these two chapters? We just kind of outlined it. What do we find striking as far as emphasized over and over again? Christ the Lamb and the worship of the Lamb. I think those are basically the two primary ideas. We have the Lamb, Christ, and He's living. That is, one who had been sacrificed and now is living. And then we have the worship of the Lamb, and we have two lengthy pictures of that worship given at the end of chapter 4 and at the end of chapter 5. So no matter if we can discern all of the details about what the four living creatures represent and regarding those who are worshiping the 24 elders, who are they? Regardless of that, we do have the general theme that it wants to think about, and that is the worship of the Lamb that is set. And as that is given, the reason for it, as far as I'm able to discern, is for us to garner the information that Christ is in control of the destiny of the world and in control of history. And it is to encourage the first century saints who are facing a lot of persecution that even though it may seem that Christ is not in control, He is in control. And these things that Christ is about to reveal shows that Christ ultimately has his hands on the reins of what's about to occur. So that's, I think, the important message that is given here. And so we have the worship. I want to say some things about worship when we get to it in just a few moments. All right, anything regarding that you want to mention or ask? One writer put it this way: these Christians needed to understand history as something ruled not by chance, not by evil men. History is not ruled by the devil, but instead it's ruled from God's throne by Jesus Christ. Is that true today? Yes, it is. We may not think about it that way, and we may get lost, but we need to remember that history is controlled by Christ, the Lamb, from the throne. They needed to see that Christ was reigning now, that He has already wrested the world from Satan's grasp, that even now all things in heaven and on earth were bound to acknowledge Him as King. They needed to see themselves in the true light, not as forgotten troops in a lonely outpost fighting a losing battle. Easy for us to think about that. But as kings and priests already waging and overcoming, predestined to victory. All right, waging war and overcoming. All right, so anything to mention regarding that? That's what we have, and that's, I think, a good tone for the purpose of these two chapters. So let's think about verses 1 through 3, and this is where the doors opened in heaven. After these things I saw, behold, a door opened in heaven, the first voice that I heard as of a trumpet speaking with me, saying, come up here, and I will show you the things which must to come to pass hereafter. Straightway, or immediately, I was in the Spirit. Behold, there was a throne set in heaven, and one sitting upon the throne, and he that sat was to look upon like jasper stone, sardius. There was a rainbow around the throne, like emerald to look upon. All right, so John is called up in heaven. Now, the important thing to remember here is simply the fact that it is a vision. Interesting. John is called to heaven in vision form, and he says, I was in the Spirit, which means what, by the way? What does it mean, I was in the Spirit? Mentally? We could put it that way. Is there mentally? Is there spiritually speaking? I was called up to heaven, and then I was in the Spirit. I've taken the phraseology in the Spirit to be inspired, a statement that this is inspired material. I was in the Spirit. That's what he tells us, for example, in chapter 1 and verse 10. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Remember that statement? I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. This is inspiration. And I think, at least in my view, this is a statement of inspiration. But let's back to the initial question here. John is called up to heaven, and the scene simply is of the throne room of God. Not to be taken literally, obviously. It's only designated with precious stones to give us an idea of its glory. But one of the interesting things about it is that premillennialists today take this as a passage that refers to, and believe it or not, the rapture. Well, I think, well, okay, what is the rapture? Now, you look at some of these commentaries, and this is all telling us the rapture, because what it is Christians are going to be called to heaven before the action begins. Before all these things start happening on the earth, Christians are called to heaven, and so then that which takes place upon the earth is not going to be that they have to suffer. All right, what about this? What say ye? Well, that's one of the that's a perfect reaction. I think that's exactly my reaction. What? From these verses alone, they get the idea that Christians are raptured to heaven. Number one, we have only John, not Christians, generally speaking. We don't have the word rapture appearing in the New Testament anywhere referring to any such thing as this, about Christians leaving the earth. We don't have that information anywhere given. And this is John, simply called to heaven, and he's there simply that he might witness what God is going to do as far as revealing what's taking place on the earth. And then later, you have the fact that Christians are being persecuted on the earth, and we find the souls of those that have been beheaded underneath the altar in seal number 5. So this is a silly thing. I would think any doctrine built upon such thin reasoning, to say it in the best way possible, is really false doctrine. But that's dispensational premillennial doctrine, and that is Christians are called to heaven in order to avoid all this what's taking place on the earth. My reaction exactly, David. Yeah, I can't hardly believe it. But I saw that, I thought, what? So I went back and looked at the verses, and I thought, what in the world led to this? So that's one thing to notice. All right, let's go down to the next verses, unless there's something you want to point out here. And incidentally, before we move on, there's only one passage, I should say the primary passage where the word tribulation appears, you might note, is Matthew 24 and verse 21. So Matthew 24 and verse 21, we have the word tribulation appearing, so you'll notice how he words it here. There shall be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall be. And we have similar wording in Revelation chapter 7 and verse 14. So if you're Matthew 24, verse 21, what's the context there? Destruction of Jerusalem. There's the tribulation. There's the great tribulation. How many times have you heard people talk about great tribulation and things are happening over in the Mideast today? And the great tribulation, that means Christ is about to return, has nothing to do with it. And this is Matthew 24, the destruction of Jerusalem. And he tells us that in verse 34 specifically. So, same thing in Revelation 7 and verse 14. He tells us, if you turn later chapters in Revelation, I say unto him, my Lord, you know. And he said to me, these are they that have come out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. There's the phrase great tribulation again, Revelation 7 and 14. And I take it that it's a reference to the same thing. That is, the persecutions that would take place at that particular time. Any thoughts on that? Yes, ma'am. Oh, now we're all confused at some point on some of this. That's all right.
Maybe off the chart, but I hear a lot about from men and 7 years of tribulation. Can you explain what that is?
Well, first of all, we have later in Revelation, we have a 7-year block that is given, 7 years, which I take to be a figurative statement. I don't remember exactly the verse where it is, but 7 years mentioned. And then you have the Great Tribulation here in 7 and 14. And then you have the Great Tribulation, Matthew 24, 21. So what ends up happening is simply they take all this, they kind of mix it up, and they come out with a potion that says, all right, Great Tribulation, 7 years, and then Christians are going to be exempt from the persecutions of that time. Say, huh?
They chose the number 7?
Well, I think 7 is a figurative number in the book of Revelation. Matter of fact, the numbers in Revelation, almost always, if I can't remember any time that they're not, always figurative in reference, not due to literal times necessarily. Now, if there is one that I can't recall what it might be, but we have a 7-year period, we have a 1,000-year period, we have a 3.5 days period. Those references are figurative, I understand to be. But to say that they're literal, I think, well, we're going against the grain of Revelation. Now, if maybe I should have asked the question again for the camera and for the recording. And she asked just about, a lot of preachers are mentioning 7-year tribulation period. What has that to do with? And so I'm explaining my understanding of where they come up with that. But the problem is that they just take all of this, they kind of mix it up, and then they come out with this particular theory, even though there's not any specific reference to it. And plus, they have a tribulation period preceded by a rapture, which, according to their theory, Christians are removed from the earth, and so the 7-year tribulation is going to take place here. So, but none of that is New Testament. None of it. The leaving of the earth, there's just nothing there like it. Ray?
Isn't the number 7 of completeness, fullness, finished?
That's normally what is thought to be the case regarding the number 7. That's true.
My book has an introduction that says the number 7 is used 52 times.
In the book of Revelation?
Of Revelation.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that. So 52 times? So there you have it. 52 weeks in a year. That's got to mean something. Okay. 52. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Revelation 7:14. Yeah. Yeah. That's what we mentioned. 7 and 14. Yeah. These are they that come out of the great tribulation. Right. So it does show us in 7:14 that Christians actually went through it. They didn't actually were removed from it, but they went through it. And that's the idea. But the broader picture here, very quickly, this is, and I'm glad you asked this question. And everybody who comments is perfectly fine, because we need to talk about these things. But what has happened here? What's happened right here? We have forgotten the main picture of Revelation. The main picture is the destruction of Jerusalem. All of a sudden, we get into the weeds, and we're talking about all these different things, and okay, well, why do they say this and that? Well, we're all of a sudden in the weeds real quickly. And so it helps me to keep in mind that this is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. So whatever the 7 years may mean, or the number 7 may mean, or 3.5 or 1,000 years, we're referring to a period of time that was in the 1st century. And that's the important thing to recall. And you see how easy it is to kind of forget all of that, say, okay, whew, now we're down in here. Like, what are we? Okay, where are we? And that's basically what happens. Yes, ma'am. Ann? All right, say that again. Okay, she asked if there was a 3.5-year period of the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, the answer is a little bit involved. I'll try briefing it up. There was a 3.5-year period where it was besieged by Rome. So it was in the year 67 that the armies were, latter part of 66, the armies were dispatched by Nero. He was actually himself in Greece at the time at some theater, and he had his general Vespasian there next to him, and he dispatched the armies that landed in Caesarea. And they went cut a huge swath down to Jerusalem, and the war actually began there. So the Jewish wars did begin at the turn of the year 66, 67. It was a 3.5-year period. And they did lay siege to the city of Jerusalem for a lengthy period as well. But when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, it was not a 3.5-year period of the destruction, but it was the wars of the Jews. That's true, 3.5 years. Yeah. It is what happened there. And some say that's exactly why we have 3.5 in the book of Revelation. So I don't know if that's helpful. Maybe it makes it a little bit more confusing. Let's see. If I can recall, I don't remember exactly the numbers, but it took some time. They laid siege to it, and Vespasian's son Titus was the one in charge of it, and they wanted to preserve the temple. So part of it collapsed early in the year 70, and the outer walls were breached, but there were inner walls also. And all the Jews thought they could protect themselves by the grand fort, which was the temple. And so he wanted to preserve that temple because it was a wonder of the world, really. But he was unable to restrain his officers because of the hatred for the Jews that they had. And they ended up destroying. Matter of fact, he was in his tent sleeping one night. And they said, "Hey, the temple's on fire." And he got up and they tried to extinguish it, but it was not able to be done. So it was just a lengthy period. I'm not sure exactly how long they sat outside, but it was so long that they did have people starving in the city. And when they starved to death, the Jews, they were starving, they tried to escape, and they would catch them and they would crucify them. So they stripped the hills around the city of Jerusalem bare of wood, and they crucified those Jews on the hills. And then they discovered that those Jews were swallowing I think Stanley even related this to me one time. The Jews swallowed their precious things, like they would have gold and silver rings and coins, and they would swallow it, thinking they would get out, and then they would pass it out of their body and have their precious things. And so the Romans discovered they were doing that, and then they ripped them open to pull them out. And it was just, it's a horrific scene, but it did take some time. So the point I'm making is it took enough time for them to begin to starve to death in the city, and they tried to escape. Yeah, and it was kind of a more involved war. Yeah.
I thought it was destroyed in 3.5 years.
Well, it did.
Other time to get rid of everybody else.
Well, they did take out a lot of Jews throughout Galilee and Judea. They had to kind of fortify the position. So they took a lot of towns, and the towns collapsed. And then there was in Galilee a lot of the towns. They just destroyed those towns, and they came down to Jerusalem. And a lot of the Jews kind of ran to the city to thinking they were going to defend it and be able to defend it successfully. That was not going to be the case. Now the Lord told them, "Don't do that." Remember, he said to the Christians, "Don't do that. Don't go into the city because it's going to fall." As he said that in Luke chapter 21. So anyway, in the year 70, finally, it did collapse. It was done. And then one stone was not left upon another. Pretty sad situation. All right, any other question on it? It is fascinating. I'm always tempted to just run through some of this history a little bit more lengthily, but that would be probably not as edifying as it needs to be. So, all right, let's look at the verse 4 here. We have the 24 elders, 24 thrones, and upon the thrones sat 24 elders arrayed in white garments, and on their heads crowns of gold. All right, let's think about for a moment, who are these elders? Who do they represent? And what is the significance of it? Well, one passage you might notice is, just to kind of get our thinking whetted here, is Matthew 19 and verse 28. So you might glance at that quickly for just a moment. That's Matthew 19 and the verses 28. And our Lord tells his apostles that in the regeneration, they will sit on the 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Interesting. I take it that he's referring to the position of authority that the apostles had in giving the law of Christ. And so today even, we might even put it this way, that we still have apostles in the church. They're not living, to be sure, they're not living apostles, but we still have the 12 apostles in the church today. They are the foundation of the church, and they are sitting on thrones still. And how do they exercise authority? What was it? Yes, by their word. They still exercise authority simply by the word of God. So that gives us an idea, but the difference here in Matthew 19 and Revelation chapter 4 is that we have 12 thrones, and in this one we have 24. So what is the 12 and 24? Well, possibly it is the case, and I'm going to give possibilities because I don't know, but it's possible that in this he has 12 apostles, and then what's another 12 from the Old Testament? 12 tribes, representative of each tribe. So some suggest that it's the apostles, the tribes of Israel all represented. Possibly to be the case. Don't know. That's correct. So that would be another, that's right. Which passage was it?
First Chronicles.
Right.
4, 1 through 9.
First Chronicles 4. So there's another possibility, and I actually like that possibility, and that is that the 24 thrones, if you didn't hear what she had mentioned, she mentioned the fact that the Old Testament courses of priests were divided up into 24 courses. Well, what does that mean, by the way, 24 courses of priests? What does that mean? They had 24 courses of priests. Well, how did that work? Well, the 24 courses was, all right, so let's say that you were a priest in the Old Testament period. You would always be, of course, from the tribe of Levi, and then the family of Kohath, but they're divided up in 24 courses. That meant, and you lived in different places. They were all situated in different towns throughout Israel. And that meant that if you're a priest, were you going to be in Jerusalem 24/7, 12 months a year? No. They're going to have a rotation basis, all right? All those who lived here in this particular area, those are the priests that's going to serve for these 2 weeks in Jerusalem. So they'd go and serve for a couple of weeks in Jerusalem, and then they'd go home to the family. Then another course would come in. All of the tribe of Levi, they'd come in from another town. So that's how they had it divided up. 24 courses of priests that operated at the temple in Jerusalem. And so the idea is here that taking 24 from the 24 courses of priests, such as was mentioned from First Chronicles, which is exactly right, that perhaps he's referring to the fact that we have symbolically 24 courses of priests, so to speak. That may be the case, 24 elders, 24 thrones. We do know that they're on thrones, and that shows victory already, doesn't it? So that's, I think, perhaps a good possibility that he's referring to 24 in that sense. That could be the case. 24. 24 representing the 24 courses of priests, but of course now New Testament Christians are priests of God, right? We're not talking about people from the tribe of Levi. We're talking about people that are people of God, Christian people. So that would be the 24 significance in chapter 4. That's possible to be the case. Any other thoughts on it?
We've got a reference, Ephesians 2:20, is foundation, built on the foundation.
Yeah, foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, Ephesians 2:20. That's right. So we have apostles, could be prophets with them, whatever it is. It may be apostles, Christian people, but I actually like the one that was mentioned, that is the 24 courses of priests. That may be the case. Some say, well, we have 24 courses of celestial angels. I don't know that that is the case. I think they're really, however we want to line up to 24, I believe there are representatives of the church. And that's what we have here. And because we know that they cast their crowns before the throne, they worship along with the 4 living creatures, which we're getting to next. So, don't know exactly the answer to that question, but that's my thoughts on it. So, any other thoughts?
I heard it's called they were the saints.
Right. The church, all right, the church is the saints, right. Right. So, every Christian is a saint, right. And we don't need to wait to be voted on to sainthood, but we're saints. All Christians are saints. All Christians are sanctified, so I do take it as a representative of Christian people who are sanctified saints before the throne of God. And that's my thought on it, exactly what she mentioned. Now let's think about the 4 living creatures. We have another fascinating, perhaps challenging line of thought here when we come down to the living creatures in verses 6 through 8. Before we go there, maybe we should mention verse 5. And that is, out of the throne proceeded lightnings, voices, thunders, 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne. We saw the 7 lamps earlier, and they represented what? 7 churches, yeah, 7 churches. So these are all representatives, which are the 7 spirits of God, which I take to be, remember, each particular church had an angel or a spirit that would be a figurative representative of the messenger of the church. And now I take it that that's what he's referring to, the same thing here. 7 spirits of God. And before the throne, as it were, a sea of glass that would be, I take it as referring to a polished floor, like crystal in the midst of the throne, round the throne, 4 living creatures full of eyes before and behind. All right, let's, I don't want to run too quickly. If you want to stop me on any particular, I'm happy to go back and pick it up, if I can. Let's think about the 4 living creatures. Where do the 4 living creatures, where does that come from? And why do we have it? What is the significance of it? Ezekiel, I think that's exactly it. So, in an apocalyptic vision, Ezekiel begins his entire book, chapter 1, showing us the throne of God. But the throne was actually a mobile throne. And Ezekiel shows that throne was being moved by 4 living creatures. And the 4 living creatures are exactly as we have right here. There may be some, a little bit of difference in it, but the 4 living creatures, he tells us, number 1, we have one was like a lion, the second like a calf, this is verse 7. The third creature had face of a man, and then we have the 4th as a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures having each one of them 6 wings, full of eyes round about and within, and they have no rest day and night, and they say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty, who was, who is to come, who is, and who is to come. All right, let's think about the 4 living creatures, and something else he put right here. Each one had 6 wings. The 4 living creatures simply, in my view, represent the omnipresence of God, and that is an apocalyptic picture that Ezekiel uses in chapter 1. 4 living creatures, almost exactly what we have here, carrying the throne of God about, but the message to the Israelites in Ezekiel's day was that God was going to leave the city of Jerusalem. That was before its destruction. He was going to exit the city of Jerusalem, and so we see from Ezekiel's vision that the throne moves out of the temple. It comes outside the outer gates, standing by the gate, leaving the city, and then goes to the hill of Olives, sits on top of it, and then goes to the east, which would be Babylon, where the children of Israel were. And that takes us through chapter 1 through 10 of Ezekiel. I think it's simply an apocalyptic picture depicting the omnipresence and omniscience of God. And I take it that that is exactly the same thing here, not to find some kind of ramification of every little thing, but simply referring to God's authority over creation. And that's what we have, in my view, regarding the 4 living creatures. All right, anything that you want to mention on that? Certainly one thing we do know, we don't have anyone that I know of taking it to be a literal idea, that these things ought to be taken with literalism. Certainly not the case. So we have at the end of it the four living creatures, and then we have the 24 elders now offering at the end of the chapter worship. Let's watch what happens with the worship. This takes us 9 through 11. We have these different verbs. Watch the verbs. Verse 9, they shall give glory and honor and thanks. Verse 10, the 420 elders shall fall down before him that sits on the throne. They shall, number 3, worship him. They shall cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Worthy art thou, O Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power. You did create all things because of your will they were created, or they were created. All right, what were the verbs here? It involves the worship. They give glory and honor, and that was before the throne. They fall down to worship. Then they shall worship, and they shall cast their crowns before the throne. Interesting, isn't it, how the worship is. Now, so what do we conclude by the worship? And I think I want us to really focus upon this for just a moment. What do we note about the worship here? Just anything that comes to your mind as you see this picture of worship. Nothing comes to mind, huh? Well,
I really like how it says they throw their crowns down as they fall before the throne.
how do we summarize that disposition?
Just showing the humility and the recognition of the almighty power of God.
And that's exactly what I glean from the passage too. Casting the crowns before the throne is humility before God. Worship involves humility before God. That's what worship is. It's humbling myself before God. That is one of the key points of the entire book regarding worship. So it involves humility before God. What else? Devotion, that they're devoted to God, devoted in their singing to God. Worthy art thou. That would be devotion, they're devoted. Recognizing the Creator. All those are true and right answers. I think those are exactly on the spot here. I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. That this is from a commentator, David Chilton, in his book called Days of Vengeance. Now he titles the book Days of Vengeance. It's a commentary on Revelation. It's a big, thick thing. But he titles it after Luke 21 and verse 21. Luke 21, 21. These are the days of vengeance when all things written shall be fulfilled. And he points out that in worship here, and I wouldn't thought of it until he pointed it out. He said, number one, worship is corporate. And we find this to be the case in the New Testament. Worship is corporate. What does that mean, corporate? That means more than one person. It's a togetherness thing. More than one person, it's a togetherness thing. Now, that's not to say that an individual cannot worship individually or alone, personally. It's not to say you can't do that, but the emphasis in the New Testament is upon corporate, gathering together, worship, people worshiping together. That's the emphasis, what we have right here, isn't it? And then a fascinating point is corporate worship. We have that throughout. You can read the book of 1 Corinthians and you'll find the emphasis about worship is corporate. Now, what does that imply? What does it say? I hear so many people say such things. Well, I'm going to go fishing this morning and I can worship on the pond as well as I can here. I think, well, we're not reading our New Testaments, number one. We just don't find that disposition anywhere, do we? Once again, not to deny that I'm not saying we cannot worship individually. When I pray, I'm worshiping. When I study, when I sing songs at home, if we sing songs, we can do that individually, can't we? Certainly we can. That's worship. We come before God's throne with humility. But we certainly don't have the disposition, well, I can find God on top of the mountain as well as I can in the church building. Well, we're not reading the New Testament. We're just reading our hearts and what we desire, really. And that's what's going on, in my view. I think, so when people say that to me, I haven't been so maybe I should be kind of have some effrontery and say, exactly how do you worship God while you're fishing? Exactly how does that work?
When you assemble, when we all come together, we have put everything else aside, and we have chosen to keep this time singly for this purpose. If you're going fishing and you're going to find God there, you're going to be out there and you're doing what you're wanting to do, and God's a sideshow.
You know what? I like the way she put it. If you're going fishing, you're doing what you want to do, and God's a sideshow. And we have set time aside to gather and assemble in His name. And that's a great point, because God becomes simply a kind of a sideshow, as you put it, just kind of a little vestibule on the side of it. Well, an afterthought. I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go on top of the mountain and hike. But, I'll find God there. You might say, well, this creation is beautiful. God created it. And that becomes all of a sudden your worship. I just like, well, we are really not serious. Yes, ma'am. Lisa?
I don't know where it is. The one I hear a lot is you don't have to assemble every Sunday.
Yeah, well, that's what we're talking about. Assembly in the New Testament, it's always corporate. It's always an assembly. There's always an assembly here.
But they believe that they're worshiping in their living room,
Yeah.
dining room, or fishing.
Right.
That they don't have to assemble.
Right.
There are a lot of women that
That's why I say they're not reading the New Testament, are they?
they don't know that, they don't know the Bible.
That's right. That's right. They don't know what it says. Yes, ma'am.
And some people apply that same theory to communion.
Yeah.
I don't have to be at church to have communion.
Yeah. Same thing. I was going to hurry through a couple of more points very quickly. Number one, worship is corporate. Number two, worship is he says responsorial. That is responsive. Now, that doesn't mean I read and you respond back, because that's what some churches do. But the idea is it's my response to God for what He's done for me. And that's exactly what Betsy was saying. It's my response. I have set aside time. I'm responding to what God has done. I'm taking time. I'm carving it out of my schedule to assemble and worship God. It's a response. And that's what worship is. And number three, worship is orderly. In the New Testament, it's always orderly. 1 Corinthians 14:40 tells us worship must be decently and in order. And he said that as a corrective to the church at Corinth that was becoming a little bit disorderly. So that's worship, and we find that right here. Worship is orderly. We find it responsive. They're responding to God, worthy art thou. And it was corporate. They were together, doing it together. Isn't that interesting? All right, anything? All right, chapter 5 next week, and then we'll get real quickly right into chapter 6 where the action begins to happen. Thank you for your participation.